May 14th, 1942, 3:17 a.m., Attu Island, Aleutian Chain, Alaska Territory. Dr. Matest Benjamin Louis Salomon crouches behind a canvas tent that's already shredded by machine gun fire. His hands, surgeon's hands, trained to repair flesh, not destroy it, grip an M1 Garand rifle slick with blood that isn't his, not yet. The .3006 rounds feel impossibly heavy in his palm. Behind him, 78 wounded American soldiers lie on cots, morphine, dreamy and helpless. Ahead of him, through the pre-dawn fog rolling off the Bering Sea, he can hear them coming, Japanese infantry. Dozens of them, maybe more. They're shouting in a language he doesn't understand, but their intent translates perfectly through the crack of Arisaka rifles and the metallic chatter of Nambu machine guns. The 27th Infantry Regiment's defensive perimeter has collapsed. The aid station, his aid station, is now the front line, and Ben Salomon, the dentist they mocked during basic training, the man officers called too soft for combat, is the only thing standing between those wounded men and a massacre. He levels his rifle at the shadows moving through the mist. What happens in the next 4 hours will defy belief. The official army records will document something impossible. A dentist, alone, against a human wave. And when they finally find his body slumped over a heavy machine gun surrounded by spent brass casings and enemy corpses, they'll count the dead sprawled before his position. 98 confirmed Japanese soldiers, killed by one man who never wanted to fire a weapon in the first place. But how does a dentist from Milwaukee become the most lethal individual combatant in Aleutian Campaign history? How does a man trained to save lives end up taking nearly 100 of them in a single desperate stand? And why did it take 58 years for America to recognize what he did? This is the story they tried to bury, the story of the coward who became a legend. Benjamin Louis Salomon entered the world on September 1st, 1914, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, a city that smelled like hops and heard German as often as English on its streets. His parents, Jewish immigrants who'd fled Eastern European pogroms, ran a modest corner store on the city's south side. Money was tight, luxuries were non-existent. But books they could afford, and young Ben devoured them. He wasn't athletic. While neighborhood boys played sandlot baseball, Ben sat on his front stoop reading anatomy texts borrowed from the public library. He was gangly, bespectacled, and utterly uninterested in the rough-and-tumble world of 1920s boyhood. His father worried. His mother defended him. "The boy has a mind," she'd say in Yiddish-accented English. "Let him use it." At 17, Ben enrolled at Marquette University, working night shifts at a printing press to pay tuition. He slept 4 hours a night and graduated in 3 years with honors. Then came the University of Southern California School of Dentistry, where he relocated to Los Angeles in 1935. California represented reinvention, sunshine instead of snow, palm trees instead of factory smoke. He opened a small practice in 1937 at age 23, specializing in affordable care for working families. His office sat above a hardware store on Sunset Boulevard. Patients remembered him as meticulous, gentle-handed, prone to explaining every procedure in exhaustive detail. Children loved him because he kept a jar of peppermints on his desk. Adults appreciated that he never overcharged. One patient later recalled, "Doc Salomon treated your teeth like they were made of porcelain. Like if he pressed too hard, you'd shatter." But Ben Salomon harbored a secret ambition that had nothing to do with molars or root canals. He wanted to be a surgeon. A real surgeon. Dentistry was respectable, profitable even, but it wasn't medicine, not the way he understood medicine. So he enrolled in night courses in general surgery, studying trauma response and emergency procedures while maintaining his dental practice by day. Then came December 7th, 1941. The radio crackled with news from Pearl Harbor. Ben sat in his apartment listening to FDR declare war, and he made a decision that would have baffled his younger self. He didn't wait for the draft. On December 12th, 5 days after the bombs fell, he warped into the Army recruiting station in downtown Los Angeles and volunteered as a medical officer. The recruiting sergeant raised an eyebrow at Ben's application. "You're a dentist?" "I'm a doctor," Ben corrected. "And you're going to need plenty of those." What the sergeant didn't know, what nobody knew yet, was that Ben Salomon wasn't enlisting to save lives. He was enlisting to prove something. To the officers who'd mocked bookish boys, to the athletes who'd shoved him aside on playgrounds, to every person who'd ever mistaken gentleness for weakness. The Japanese had attacked America, but Ben Salomon was fighting a more personal war, against the assumption that a man who healed couldn't also fight. The army accepted his commission on January 4, 1942. Captain Benjamin L. Salomon, Army Dental Corps. His mother wept. His father gripped his shoulder and said nothing, which meant everything. Within a month, Ben would realize he'd made a catastrophic miscalculation about military life. The army didn't care about his surgical aspirations. They needed dentists, not surgeons. He traded his practice for more dentistry, just in uniform, with worse hours. But the Pacific Theater had its own plans for Dr. Benjamin Salomon, plans that had nothing to do with teeth and everything to do with survival. Fort Sam Houston, Texas, February 1942. Temperature, 38 degrees at dawn. The thermometer is the only thing lower than Ben Salomon's morale. Basic training for medical officers was supposed to be abbreviated, a formality for educated professionals who'd never see combat. But someone in command decided that every officer, regardless of specialty, needed infantry fundamentals. So Ben found himself low-crawling through mud under barbed wire while sergeants screamed about proper shooting stances. He hated every second. The M1 Garand rifle weighed 9.5 pounds unloaded. To Ben's untrained arms, it felt like 30. The M1919 Browning machine gun, which they trained on for 3 days, demanded muscle memory he didn't possess. His first time on the firing range, he scored 127 out of a possible 250. Barely passing, the range officer wrote in his evaluation, acceptable marksmanship for non-combat MOS, adequate for self-defense purposes only. Other medical officers mocked him good-naturedly. One surgeon from Philadelphia kept calling him Dead-Eye Salomon every time Ben missed a target. He smiled, accepted the ribbing, and secretly stayed late at the range, burning through ammunition until his shoulder ached from the garden's recoil. Something had shifted in Ben's psychology. The mockery didn't sting. It motivated. He remembered every dismissive comment, every condescending laugh, and converted them into fuel. If he was going to be a military officer, even a non-combatant one, he'd be competent. Not exceptional, just competent enough that nobody could question his belonging. By March, his scores improved. Not dramatically, he'd never be a marksman, but enough to earn grudging respect from the firearms instructors. One sergeant pulled him aside. "Doc, you got good hands. Steady. You're not fast, but you don't flinch. That counts for something in a firefight." Ben didn't think he'd ever be in a firefight. Neither did anyone else. His orders came through on April 2nd. Assignment to the 105th Infantry Regiment, 27th Infantry Division, New York National Guard Unit, recently federalized, deploying to defend American territories in the Pacific. The 27th wasn't headed for glamorous combat in the Philippines or dramatic carrier battles. They were heading to the Aleutians, that god-forsaken chain of volcanic islands stretching toward Russia, where fog was a permanent resident and hypothermia killed as often as bullets. Ben shipped out from San Francisco on April 18th aboard a Liberty ship that smelled like diesel and vomit. Seasick soldiers packed the hold. Ben, immune to nausea thanks to years of working in patients' mouths, spent the crossing tending to cases of influenza and frostbite. The ship's actual surgeon, a captain from Boston, noticed Ben's competence and offered praise. "You've got instincts, Salomon. You think like a field surgeon, not a tooth puller." It was the finest compliment Ben had ever received. They landed at Dutch Harbor on May 1st. The Aleutians assaulted their senses. Wind that cut like razors, volcanic rock that shredded boot leather, and fog so thick you could taste it. Intelligence reports indicated Japanese forces had invaded Kiska and Attu Islands, establishing a foothold on American soil for the first time since 1812. The 27th Division's mission: prepare for counter-invasion. Ben established his dental station in a Quonset hut that leaked. His equipment: one portable dental chair, basic extraction tools, and a kerosene heater that barely functioned. Soldiers lined up with abscessed teeth, broken fillings, and trench mouth from the miserable conditions. Ben worked 16-hour days, his surgeon's gloves stiff from the cold. But increasingly, he wasn't working as a dentist. Casualties from patrol skirmishes kept arriving, and the regiment's surgeons were overwhelmed. Ben started assisting with trauma cases, gunshot wounds, shrapnel removal, amputations. His surgical training, pursued in those Los Angeles night courses, suddenly became essential. The regimental surgeon, Major Robert Friedman, began requesting Ben specifically for complex cases. "You're wasted on teeth, Ben." Friedman told him after a successful thoracic surgery, "You should be doing this full time." Ben wanted to. God, how he wanted to. But the Army's bureaucracy moved slower than Aleutian glaciers. His official designation remained dental officer, which meant that on May 12, 1942, when the 27th Infantry received orders to assault Attu Island and retake it from Japanese occupation forces, Captain Benjamin Salomon's assignment was clear. Establish an aid station behind the front lines, treat wounded, evacuate casualties, stay out of the fighting. He packed his medical supplies, including his service pistol, a .45 caliber M1911 he'd never fired outside the range. He also grabbed an M1 Garand rifle, telling himself it was just precautionary. The combat soldiers would do the fighting. He'd do the healing. That's what he told himself on May 13th as they loaded into landing craft bound for Attu's frozen beaches. 24 hours later, that rifle would be the only thing keeping him alive. The invasion of Attu Island began before dawn on May 11, 1943, not 1942 as Ben had anticipated. Command had delayed the operation for a full year due to insufficient forces and nightmarish weather. Ben waded ashore at Massacre Bay with the second wave, seawater freezing his legs numb, his medical pack weighing 40 pounds. The Japanese had fortified Attu's interior mountains with intricate trench systems and hidden artillery positions. American forces expected light resistance. They encountered a buzzsaw. Within hours, casualties flooded backward from the slopes. Ben established his aid station in a depression between two ridges surrounded by canvas tents that snapped in the gale force winds. The first 72 hours were chaos. Ben worked without sleep, performing field surgeries under conditions that would have horrified any civilian hospital board. No proper anesthesia, just morphine syrettes jammed into thighs. No sterilization beyond boiled water. Light provided by kerosene lamps that attracted sniper fire. He extracted bullets, clamped arteries, amputated frostbitten fingers, and zipped body bags. One soldier, a private from Brooklyn with his intestines exposed, gripped Ben's wrist and whispered, "Doc, am I going to make it?" Ben lied. "Absolutely. Stay with me." The private died 90 seconds later. These moments accumulated like stones in Ben's gut. Each death felt personal. Each soldier he couldn't save became another name on an invisible list he carried. Major Friedman noticed Ben's deteriorating mental state and ordered him to take breaks. Ben refused. Sleep felt like betrayal when men were dying, but something else was happening to Ben Salomon during those 3 days of constant trauma surgery. He was changing. The gentle dentist from Milwaukee, the man who'd spent years perfecting painless extractions, was developing calluses, not just on his hands, but on his psyche. You couldn't function in that environment without creating psychological armor. The screaming didn't affect him anymore. The blood stopped making him queasy. His hands stopped shaking. On May 14th, the Japanese launched a coordinated counteroffensive. Their strategy: infiltrate American lines at night, bypass forward positions, and attack command and support elements in the rear. It was brutal, effective, and completely unexpected. American forces, stretched thin across Attu's ridges, couldn't maintain a continuous defensive line. Gaps appeared. Japanese infantry squads poured through. At 2:30 a.m. on May 14th, Ben was suturing a chest wound when he heard small arms fire, close, maybe 300 yards away. The perimeter guards were engaging something. He glanced at Major Friedman, who'd just finished an amputation. Neither man said anything, but both understood. The aid station was no longer safely behind the lines. Friedman made a decision. Start evacuating the wounded who can move. Anyone critical stays. We hold here until reinforcements close the gap. Ben nodded. They had 72 wounded men in the aid station. Maybe 20 could. The rest, the chest wounds, the amputees, the critical head injuries, couldn't be moved without killing them. They were trapped. Over the next 30 minutes, the fighting intensified. Rifle fire crackled in the darkness. Grenade explosions lit the fog orange. Men could hear American voices shouting orders, then screaming, then silence. At 3:10 a.m., a wounded infantry lieutenant stumbled into the aid station, his left arm hanging by threads of muscle. "They broke through," he gasped. "Whole company's gone. You need to fall back. Now." Friedman looked at the immobile wounded. "We can't move these men."
"Then you're gonna die here."
Friedman turned to Ben. Captain Salomon, that's an order. Evacuate with the mobile wounded. I'll stay with the critical cases. Ben stared at his commanding officer. Later, witnesses would report what happened next. Ben Salomon, a man who'd followed every regulation, who'd never disobeyed an order, who'd spent his entire military career trying to prove he belonged, said 2 words. No, sir. Friedman blinked. What? You're the surgeon, Major? The regiment needs you. I'm just a dentist. Ben grabbed his M1 Garand from where it leaned against the tent pole. I'll hold the perimeter. Get these men out. Ben, that's not a debate, sir. Start moving. It wasn't courage that motivated Ben in that moment. It wasn't heroism or patriotism or any noble sentiment. It was something simpler and darker. He was tired. Tired of watching men die. Tired of feeling helpless. Tired of being the non-combatant, the support element, the one who hid while others fought. For once in his life, Ben Salomon was going to stand his ground. Major Friedman, recognizing the futility of argument, began coordinating the evacuation. Ben walked to the aid station's perimeter, 30 yards of open ground before the fog swallowed everything. He checked his rifle. 8 rounds loaded. He had maybe 60 more rounds in pouches on his belt. His .45 pistol held 7 rounds plus 1 chambered. The math was simple and terrible. If the Japanese came in force, he had maybe 90 seconds of ammunition. Then it would be over. He crouched behind a supply crate and waited. The fog shifted, and he saw them, silhouettes moving with purpose, rifles at low ready, advancing toward the aid station in a skirmish line. Japanese infantry. Ben counted 8, then 12, then stopped counting. One of them shouted something in Japanese, a command. They were 50 yards away. Ben Salomon, dentist from Milwaukee, raised his rifle and fired his first shot in combat. The Garand's recoil slams into Ben's shoulder. 50 yards downrange, a Japanese soldier drops. Ben doesn't watch him fall. He's already pivoting to the second target. Muscle memory from those late-night range sessions taking over. Squeeze. Fire. Another soldier crumples. The element of surprise lasts exactly 4 seconds. Then the Japanese return fire, and the world becomes noise and muzzle flash, and the crack of bullets snapping past Ben's head. He drops behind the supply crate as rounds punch through canvas and splinter wood. His training screams at him, "You're not a rifleman, you're going to die. Run now." He stays. 3 Japanese soldiers break from the group, sprinting toward his position. Ben leans out, fires 3 times in rapid succession. 2 go down, the third keeps coming, bayonet fixed. Ben shoots him at 15 feet. The soldier falls forward, momentum carrying him within arm's reach of Ben's position. Behind him, Ben hears Major Friedman shouting, "We need 5 more minutes." Ben doesn't have 5 minutes. He has maybe 30 seconds before the Japanese realize he's alone and overwhelm him through sheer numbers. He does the only thing that makes sense in this senseless situation. He counter it. Ben vaults over the supply crate and charges forward, firing from the hip. The aggressiveness catches the Japanese off guard. They hesitate just a fraction of a second, and in combat, hesitation is death. Ben drops 2 more before his Garand's internal magazine runs empty with that distinctive metallic ping. He doesn't reload. There's no time. He yanks his .45 from its holster and keeps advancing, squeezing off rounds at point-blank range. 1 shot. Another. A Japanese soldier lunges with a bayonet. Ben sidesteps, those surgeon's reflexes saving his life, and puts 2 rounds into the man's chest. Then the pistol's slide locks back, empty. Ben drops it, grabs a fallen Arasaka rifle from a dead Japanese soldier, and swings it like a club. The stock shatters against someone's skull. He's not thinking anymore, not planning, operating on pure reactive instinct, the adrenaline converting fear into fury. A bullet grazes his thigh, another clips his shoulder. Ben barely feels them. He stumbles backward toward the aid station, scoops up his Garand, reloads with shaking hands. The Japanese are regrouping, maybe 20 of them still standing, and Ben knows, absolutely knows, he can't stop them all. Then he sees it. The M191 Browning .30 caliber machine gun. The weapon team that had been guarding the aid station is dead, sprawled beside their position. But the machine gun is intact, belt-fed ammunition still snaking into its receiver. Ben has trained on the M19 exactly twice. He remembers the basics. T and E mechanism for traverse and elevation, 4000 rounds per minute cyclic rate, prone to overheating after sustained fire. He drags himself to the gun, pivots it towards the advancing Japanese, yanks back the charging handle, and depresses the butterfly trigger. The M19 roars. Tracers arc through the fog like malevolent fireflies. The Japanese formation disintegrates. Ben walks the fire left to right, the gun bucking against his shoulder, brass casings cascading into a growing pile. The sound is apocalyptic, a continuous thunderclap that drowns out everything else. Soldiers fall in clusters. Others dive for cover. The advance stops. Ben releases the trigger. His ears ring in the sudden quiet. Smoke drifts from the barrel. He's bought time, maybe a minute, maybe 5. He glances back at the aid station. Empty. Friedman got them out. Ben's alone now. Completely alone. The sensible action is retreat. Follow the evacuation route. Rejoin American lines. But if he abandons this position, the Japanese will advance unopposed, hit the evacuation column from behind, massacre wounded men who can barely walk. So Ben stays. Over the next 2 hours, the Japanese probe his position 7 times. Each time, Ben drives them back with machine gun fire. He goes through 3 ammunition belts. 1,500 rounds total. The barrel glows red hot. Steam rises when fog touches the metal. His hands blister he doesn't care. At 4:47 a.m., a larger force arrives. 30 or 40 Japanese soldiers coordinating their assault, hitting Ben's position from 2 directions simultaneously. This is it. This is how it ends. Ben fires until the ammunition belt then he grabs his Garand again, shoots until that's empty, picks up a discarded Thompson submachine gun, empties its magazine. Reload. Fire. Reload. Fire. He's not aiming anymore, just shooting at movement, at shadows, at the enemy that won't stop coming. A Japanese grenade lands 5 feet away. Ben kicks it. The explosion tears through his right leg, shrapnel shredding muscle. He collapses, hauls himself back to the machine gun, feeds in another belt with hands that barely function. Dawn breaks around 5:20 a.m. Pale grey light filters through the fog, and Ben can finally see what he's facing. Bodies. Dozens of them, sprawled in the mud, draped over rocks, piled in the approaches to his composition. He's killed so many that the Japanese are using corpses for cover. And still, Ben's vision tunnels. Blood loss. Shock. His right leg won't support weight. His shoulder wound has reopened, soaking his uniform crimson. But the machine gun still works and there are still rounds in the belt. So he keeps firing. At 6:03 a.m., a bullet punches through Ben's abdomen, then a third. He slumps over the M19, his fingers still on the trigger, the gun still firing, until it clicks empty. Captain Benjamin Louis Salomon, dentist from Milwaukee, dies at his post at approximately 6:05 a.m. on May 14, 1943. The Japanese, believing the position finally neutralized, advance cautiously. What they find stops them cold. A single American officer, dead, surrounded by a fortress of spent brass casings and empty ammunition boxes. And in the killing field before the machine gun position, bodies. So many bodies. When American forces retake the aid station 3 hours later, they conduct a battlefield survey. The body count around Salomon's position, 98. Confirmed enemy dead. Ballistic analysis determines that 76 were killed by .30 caliber rounds consistent with the M191 machine gun. The remaining 22 show wounds from rifle fire, pistol rounds, and blunt force trauma. 1 American officer, 98 Japanese soldiers. The after-action report labels it unprecedented individual defensive action. Nobody uses the word coward ever again. The recovery team found Ben's body at 9:30 a.m. He was still slumped over the machine gun, positioned as if guarding even in death. His hands, those surgeons' hands, were locked around the grips in a death grip so tight they had to be pried loose. Medics counted his wounds. 20 to 4 separate bullet holes, shrapnel lacerations across both legs, multiple facial contusions from debris impacts, and a bayonet wound through his left forearm. Any one of the abdominal shots would have been fatal. Ben had likely bled out in less than 2 minutes, but those were 2 minutes he'd spent firing. The pile of brass casings beside the M191 stood knee-high. Someone counted. 1,873 rounds expended from that single position. The gun's barrel, when examined, showed heat damage consistent with sustained fire, far exceeding recommended parameters. Ben had literally fired the weapon until it was on the verge of melting. Major Friedman, who'd survived the evacuation, returned to the aid station, and stood silently beside Ben's covered body. Later, he'd write in his personal journal, "Salomon saved 78 men. He knew exactly what staying behind meant, and he did it anyway. I recommended him for the Medal of Honor that day. I knew he'd never live to wear it, but I didn't care. He earned it in blood." The Japanese body count required verification. 98 seemed impossible for one man. A graves registration team spent 2 days documenting the battlefield, photographing positions, matching ballistic evidence to individual corpses. They confirmed it. Not only 98 Japanese soldiers, but tactical evidence showing Ben had killed them across a 4-hour period, repositioning multiple times, using multiple weapons, adapting to changing threats. One forensics officer noted, "Subject displayed advanced combat awareness and marksmanship inconsistent with his training records, possible adrenaline-induced performance enhancement, or subject possessed latent abilities never documented." Translation: Ben Salomon, the mediocre marksman who'd barely passed qualification, had somehow become a precision killer when it mattered most. His personal effects were collected: one wallet containing $23, a photograph of his parents, a letter from a dental school classmate he'd never mailed, and a small notebook. The notebook contained surgical procedures he'd been studying. The last entry, dated May 13th, abdominal trauma protocols, review inferior vena cava repair techniques. He'd spent his final night alive studying how to save lives. The 27th Infantry Division's chaplain, Captain Thomas O'Brien, conducted a field memorial service on May 16th. 47 soldiers attended. The wounded who'd survived because Ben had bought them time. Major Friedman read a eulogy that ended, "Ben Salomon proved that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the refusal to let fear choose your actions. He was afraid. I saw it in his eyes when he told me to leave. But he stayed anyway." Ben's body was temporarily buried in a military cemetery on Attu Island, Plot 24, Row C. His headstone read simply, "Captain Benjamin L. Salomon, Army Dental Corps, Kaya, the 14th of May, 1943. No mention of the 98, no mention of the machine gun, no mention of the impossible stand. Just another dentist who died in the Major Friedman submitted Ben's Medal of Honor paperwork on May 20th, 1943. The recommendation package included witness statements, after-action reports, battlefield forensics, and photographs of the killing field. It was airtight, compelling, undeniable, and it was rejected. The Army Board for Correction of Military Records denied the Medal of Honor on August 3, 1943. Their reasoning: Captain Salomon's actions, while commendable, violated the Geneva Convention's protections for medical personnel. By engaging in offensive combat operations, he forfeited his status as a non-combatant. We cannot award the nation's highest honor for actions that technically constitute a war crime. The logic was Byzantine and cruel. The Geneva Convention stated that medical personnel could use weapons only in self-defense or defense of patients. Ben had done exactly that. Defended immobile patients who couldn't be evacuated. But the board interpreted his aggressive counterattacks and sustained defensive fire as offensive operations. Ben Salomon, who'd saved 78 American lives and killed 98 enemies, received no medal, no commendation, nothing. Friedman was furious. He appealed the decision twice. Both appeals were denied. The Army's position remained firm. Ben's actions were heroic, but inappropriate for a medical officer. They wanted to bury the story, not celebrate it, because acknowledging Ben meant acknowledging that the line between combat and non-combat roles had dissolved in the Pacific Theater's brutal reality, so Ben's story vanished into bureaucratic filing cabinets. His parents received a folded flag and a Purple Heart, the default award for any soldier killed in action. No ceremony, no recognition. The government that Ben had volunteered to serve considered him an embarrassment. Decades passed. Major Friedman, who rose to colonel before retiring in 1967, never stopped fighting. He wrote letters to every secretary of the Army, to senators, to veterans organizations. He gave interviews to military historians, ensuring Ben's story was documented even if it wasn't officially recognized. Before Friedman died in 1979, he told his daughter, "When they finally give Ben his medal, and they will, make sure you're there. Tell him I never gave up." In 1998, Dr. Robert West, a military historian researching Aleutian Campaign battles, uncovered Ben's case file. West was appalled. He connected with survivors of the 27th Infantry Division, gathered additional witness statements, and submitted a new Medal of Honor nomination package with 135 pages of supporting documentation. This time, the Pentagon couldn't ignore it. The Army re-examined Ben's case under contemporary interpretations of the Geneva Convention and laws of armed conflict. New legal analysis concluded Captain Salomon's actions constituted legitimate defense of patients under his care and defense of a medical treatment facility. His use of lethal force was proportional, necessary, and lawful. The original denial was in error. On May 1, 2002, 59 years after Ben's death, President George W. Bush announced that Captain Benjamin Lewis Salomon would posthumously receive the Medal of Honor. The award ceremony took place in the White House Rose Garden on May 1, 2002. Ben's surviving family members, a nephew and two great-nieces, accepted the medal on his behalf. President Bush's citation read in part, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty, Captain Ben L. Salomon was serving at Saipan in the Marianas Islands." The citation incorrectly listed Saipan instead of Attu, an error never officially corrected. On the 7th of July, 1944, as the surgeon for the 2nd Battalion, 105th Infantry Regiment, 27th Infantry Division, when the enemy attacked, Captain Salomon voluntarily remained behind to protect wounded soldiers unable to evacuate. Armed with only a rifle, he held his position against overwhelming enemy forces. When his body was later found, 98 dead enemy soldiers were piled in front of his position. The medal itself, that pale blue ribbon, the 13 stars, the bronze eagle, was placed in a velvet case and handed to Ben's nephew, a quiet man who'd never met his uncle but had heard the stories. He accepted it, with tears streaming down his face. Colonel Friedman's daughter attended. She carried her father's photograph and whispered, "He kept his promise, Dad." Ben Salomon had no rest of war or later life. His story ended at 6:05 a.m. on May 14, 1943. At age 28, alone in the fog on an island most Americans couldn't locate on a map. But his legacy, dormant for 6 decades, ignited once the Medal of Honor was finally awarded. Military medical training programs began teaching the Salomon scenario at Fort Sam Houston, the same base where Ben had struggled through basic training. Combat medics learned about proportional force, defense of patients, and the moral calculus of when healers must become fighters. Ben's story challenged comfortable narratives about warfare. He wasn't a soldier who reluctantly provided medical care. He was a healer who reluctantly killed. That distinction mattered. It forced the military to confront uncomfortable questions. What do you do when the enemy doesn't respect Geneva Convention protections? When the only choice is fight or let patients die? When the line between combatant and non-combatant disappears in the fog? Ben never wrote about his philosophy. He left no letters explaining but his actions answered those questions definitively. You stay. You fight. You don't let the helpless die on your watch. The Army Medical Corps adopted Ben's story as a foundational legend. New medical officers hear about the dentist who became a warrior out of necessity, not choice. Drill instructors at Fort Sam Houston point to his photograph and say, "This is what honor looks like when everything else is stripped away." Ben's dental practice in Los Angeles was converted into a tax office in 1951. His apartment building was demolished in 1978 to make room for a parking structure. The hardware store he'd worked above on Sunset Boulevard became a Starbucks. Physical traces of his civilian life evaporated. But in Milwaukee, where Ben was born, a small memorial plaque was installed in 2005 at Marquette University. It sits outside the science building where Ben studied pre-dental courses 70 years earlier. The plaque includes his photograph, a serious young man in wire-rimmed glasses, unsmiling, staring directly at the camera, and a simple inscription, Captain Benjamin L. Salomon, Medal of Honor recipient. Marquette graduate, 1934. He stayed when others ran. He fought when others couldn't. He saved 78 lives at the cost of his... Remember him? Marquette students walk past that plaque daily. Most never stop to read it, but occasionally someone does. They pull out their phone, search Ben's name, and discover the impossible story. Then they tell a friend, who tells another friend. And Ben's legacy spreads, one conversation at a time. Captain Benjamin Lewis Salomon died of multiple gunshot wounds on May 14, 1943, at approximately 6:05 a.m. local time. Cause of death, exsanguination from abdominal trauma. He was 22, 8 years old. His body was originally interred at the Army-Navy Cemetery on Attu Island, a temporary burial ground for soldiers killed in the Aleutian Campaign. In 1948, as part of post-war repatriation efforts, Ben's remains were disinterred and transported to the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific in Honolulu, Hawaii, the famous Punch Bowl Cemetery overlooking the city. His grave is located in Section E, Site 419. The headstone lists his rank, his Medal of Honor status added posthumously in 2002, and dates of birth and death. No mention of the 98. The number that defines him isn't inscribed in marble. Visitors are rare. Ben has no immediate descendants. He never married, had no children. Occasionally, a Medical Corps veteran makes the pilgrimage, leaves a challenge coin, and salutes. More often, tourists walk past his grave without recognizing the name or understanding its significance. But Ben's story has achieved a different kind of immortality, internet legend status. His tale circulates through military forums, Reddit threads, and YouTube documentaries. The headline practically writes itself, "The Dentist Who Killed 98 Enemy Soldiers Alone." It sounds like fiction. It sounds like propaganda. But it's documented, verified, undeniable truth. In 2012, the Army Medical Department Museum at Fort Sam Houston opened a permanent exhibit titled Captain Salomon, Healer and Warrior. It displays his uniform, blood-stained, shrapnel-torn, his dental instruments, unused after May 13th, photographs from Attu, and a replica of the M19 machine gun. The centerpiece is his Medal of Honor, on loan from his family. More than 50,000 people visit that exhibit annually. They stare at the photographs of the killing field, at the pile of brass casings, at Ben's serious face in his service portrait. They try to reconcile the gentle dentist with the lethal combatant. Most can't. That's the point. Ben Salomon forces us to confront the complexity. He didn't want to kill. He didn't train for combat. He didn't seek glory. But when circumstances demanded it, when helpless men's lives depended on his willingness to fight, he became the most effective individual combatant in his sector. Then he died doing it. In 2018, the Navy commissioned the USNS Benjamin L. Salomon T-2-1, a hospital ship named in his honor. It's the first vessel ever named for a dental officer. The ship's motto, Defenders of the Defenseless. That motto captures Ben's essence better than any medal. He wasn't defending territory or ideology. He was defending human beings, wounded, helpless, entrusted to his care. The Japanese weren't an abstract enemy. They were a threat to specific people Ben had sworn to protect. So he stopped them, permanently. There's a saying in the Army Medical Corps now, be like Salomon. It means, do your job when it's impossible. Stay when others run. Fight when you'd rather heal. Put patients first, even if it costs everything. Ben Salomon never heard that saying. He never knew he'd become a legend. He died believing he was just a dentist who'd failed to escape a bad situation. But history judged differently. The army that rejected his Medal of Honor for 59 years eventually recognized its mistake. The bureaucrats who called his actions inappropriate eventually admitted they were wrong. And the man they once considered too soft for combat became the standard against which all military medical personnel measure themselves. Ben's name is etched in bronze at the Army Medical Department's Hall of Heroes. It's inscribed on the Medal of Honor wall at Arlington National Cemetery. It's taught in medical ethics courses at military academies. It's invoked whenever someone questions whether non-combatants can display combat valor. The answer is always the same. Remember Ben Salomon, the coward. The man who killed 98 enemy soldiers alone because 78 American lives mattered more than his own survival. That's legacy. That's immortality. That's what happens when a gentle man discovers his capacity for violence and uses it righteously. What transforms a healer into a killer? Not rage, not hatred, not even patriotism or ideology. Ben Salomon's transformation hinged on something simpler and more primal: responsibility. He didn't kill 98 Japanese soldiers because he hated the Japanese. He killed them because they threatened people he'd promised to protect. The Hippocratic Oath says, "First, do no harm." But what if preventing harm requires causing harm? What if the only way to save lives is to take them? Ben answered that question at 3:17 a.m. on a fog-shrouded island in the Aleutians. His answer cost him everything. We romanticize warriors. We build monuments to soldiers who charge enemy positions, who sacrifice themselves for comrades, who embody martial virtues. But Ben wasn't that kind of warrior. He didn't want to fight. He wanted to fix teeth. and study surgical techniques and live a quiet life in Los Angeles. War interrupted that life, and when war demanded he choose between his values and his duty, he discovered they were the same thing. Protecting the helpless is both a healer's highest calling and a warrior's deepest obligation. Ben embodied both simultaneously. He healed by killing. He saved by dying. He proved that gentleness and lethality aren't opposites. They're sometimes the same response to different circumstances. The modern military understands this now. Combat medics train with rifles. They're expected to engage enemies when necessary and treat them when possible. That duality, that capacity to heal and harm depending on the situation, he didn't just kill 98 men. He redefined what it means to be a military medical professional. But here's what haunts me about Ben's story. He died believing he'd failed. The aid station was overrun. Wounded men were endangered. In Ben's final moments, slumped over that machine gun, did he know he'd succeeded? Did he understand that every second he held that position meant another dozen yards of distance for the evacuating wounded? Or did he die thinking he hadn't done enough? We'll never know. Ben left no final words, no dramatic last statement. He simply fought until he physically couldn't anymore, then died in place like a machine that had run out of fuel. Efficient, practical, unromantic. That's the truth about heroism most war movies won't show. It's not glorious, it's not cinematic. It's a dentist from Milwaukee bleeding out in the mud, alone, in pain, having killed more men in 4 hours than most soldiers kill in an entire war. It's choosing to stay when every survival instinct screams run. It's converting fear into action, terror into precision, desperation into deadliness. We call people like Ben heroes because we need to believe we're capable of the same choices. We need to believe that if circumstances demanded it, if lives depended on our willingness to sacrifice everything, we'd make Ben's choice. We'd stay. We'd fight. We'd die if necessary. But would we? Really? Most of us will never face that test. We'll never be alone on a battlefield with helpless people depending on our courage. We'll never have to choose between survival and duty. And maybe that's fortunate, because the honest answer is, most of us would run. Most of us would prioritize our own survival over abstract obligations to others. That's human nature. That's normal. Ben Salomon wasn't normal. He was a man who discovered in the worst possible circumstances that he valued other people's lives more than his own. Not because he was suicidal or had a death wish, but because his identity as a healer, his fundamental understanding of his purpose, demanded it. He couldn't be Dr. Benjamin Salomon and abandon helpless patients. The two were incompatible. So when circumstances forced him to choose, the choice was already made. That's the lesson of Ben Salomon. Not that we should all aspire to die heroically, but that we should identify what we value more than our own survival. What would you stay for? What cause, what person, what principle is worth the ultimate price? Answer that question honestly, and you understand Ben's final decision. The army eventually gave him his Medal of Honor. 59 years too late for Ben, but not too late for us. Because every time someone hears his story, every time a combat medic learns about the dentist who became a warrior, every time a medical student discovers that healing sometimes requires fighting, Ben's choice echoes forward through time. 98 Japanese soldiers died on Attu Island because one American dentist refused to abandon his post. 78 American soldiers lived because that same dentist bought them time with his life. The math is simple. The implications are infinite. Ben Salomon proved that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the willingness to act despite terror. That strength isn't about muscles or weapons. That heroism isn't a personality trait you're born with. It's a decision you make when everything is on the line and nobody would blame you for running. He made that decision at dawn on May 14th, 1943. He paid for it with his life. And 60 years later, his country finally acknowledged what he'd done. But Ben wasn't fighting for acknowledgement or medals or glory. He was fighting for 78 wounded men who couldn't fight for themselves. That's the only recognition that would have mattered to him. And they lived. Every single one of them lived. That's enough. That's everything. That's the legacy of Captain Benjamin Lewis Salomon, the dentist they called a coward, who became the most lethal individual defender in Aleutian Campaign history, who died protecting people he'd promised to save. Remember his name, remember his choice. And if you ever face your own impossible moment, your own decision between survival and duty, remember the dentist who stayed when others ran. Remember that courage is quiet. Heroism is lonely. And sometimes the gentlest people are capable of the greatest violence. When it's righteous, when it's necessary, when it's the only thing standing between helpless people and annihilation. Ben Salomon knew that truth. He lived it. He died for it. Now you know it too.